Hi everyone. It is almost the new year, so it's time to start making new TBR piles and plans of books that you want to start reading in the new year. And one of my big goals for 2019 is to continue reading some more classic books because I don't often read all that many classic books. But in 2018, I was working in a temporary position where I was curating groups of classic books for a reader analytics company, and that position came to an end because it was just a temporary project-based job. But it did inspire me to read a number of classic books. Like I read Frankenstein for the first time, and Wuthering Heights, and Margaret Cavendish's novel The Blazing World, and Sylvia Townsend Warner's novel Summer Will Show. And I enjoyed reading these books so much, and I find it really fascinating reading books that were published a long time ago because I, mainly read new literary fiction, and so I like to have a reason to push myself to go back and read classic books, because I find if I don't have a specific reason for doing so, I'll just end up reading new books. And so I thought a good inspiration for that would be to research and look at different kinds of books that are going to be having either new films of them made in 2019 or have special anniversaries surrounding them, like a anniversary of the birth of an author or an anniversary of the publication of a really big classic book. So I've researched 19 classic books that I want to read in 2019. So I'll talk about those books and the reasons why I'm picking them. And also, I went out of my way to research a more diverse group of books. I mean, it's not super diverse, but it's I find with groups of when people make lists of classic books they want to read, it tends to be like Tolstoy or Dickens, and there's nothing wrong with those authors. It's great to read them, but it tends to be just sort of the same old white men, and so I want to make a more interesting group of books. And almost all of these books on this list I've never read before, so it's going to be really exciting experiencing them for the first time. And there's just a couple of rereads on the list which I read so long ago that I can barely remember what they're about or what the experience of reading them is like. So the first group of books I'm going to talk about are books that are going to be made into films in 2019. And I'm one of those people that always likes to read the book before going to see the film. I don't want to be picturing the actors in my mind and how they interpreted the characters as I'm reading the book. So I want to make sure to read these books first before going to see the films, because the films sound really exciting. So the first is Little Women by Louisa May Alcott, and it's being directed by Greta Gerwig, which is really exciting and has an amazing sounding cast. So there is Saoirse Ronan, Timothée Chalamet, Laura Dern, Meryl Streep. So great group of characters. And so this novel is all about the March sisters, about their development from their teenage years into womanhood, and their very different personality types, and obviously a very classic novel, but one that I have never read. Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. This is being made into a mini-series starring George Clooney and Hugh Laurie, which sounds super interesting, but I've always been a bit intimidated to read this novel just because it seems like it might be quite difficult and it's quite long, but I am really interested to read it and experience it. So it's a satirical novel about World War II, told from many different characters' perspectives from different men in the military. The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, and this is being made into a modern-day set film adaptation, and the film is just going to be called The Turning. It's being produced by Steven Spielberg, and it is starring Finn Wolfhard, who was the main boy in Stranger Things, the TV show Stranger Things. So that's really exciting, and he has that sort of spooky look about him, so I think that's going to be perfect for this story. And I actually read this novella back when I was in university, but I can barely remember it. It didn't make that much of an impact on me, and it is such a like classic influential tale that I'd really like to experience it again. So it's a psychological thriller ghost story about a governess who goes to care for these two children on a very remote estate, and then she comes to believe that this remote estate and the grounds are haunted. Native Son by Richard Wright. This is being made into a film starring Nick Robinson, who is the main boy in the film Love, Simon, and also Ashton Sanders, who was in the film Moonlight. And those are two films that I love so much. And so the story of the novel is about a 20-year-old African-American man named Bigger Thomas who lives in Chicago's South Side in the 1930s. The next book I want to mention is part of a book prize anniversary, and that is the novel Something to Answer For by P.H. Newby. And this won the very first Booker Prize in 1969, so 50 years ago. And it's about a fund distributor who steals from the funds that he manages, but it's also a novel about war and asks questions about how culpable we are for the decisions that our government make. Next, I want to talk about several authors who have big birthdays in 2019. So the first of those is Walt Whitman, who was born on the 31st of May in 1819, so 200 years ago. So I'd like to read Leaves of Grass, which I've never read before. And famously, Walt Whitman revised this book over the course of his life, like many years after its initial publication, and he kept adding and adding to it, including an elegy to Lincoln after Lincoln was assassinated. And so yeah, I'm really fascinated to read these poems for the first time. A lot of the poems interconnect with each other, and they sort of expound upon Whitman's philosophies about love and humanity and the human condition. It is also going to be George Eliot's 200th birthday. She was born on November 22nd, 1819, and the novel of hers that I would like to read, I've read a number of her novels, including Middlemarch, which I love so much, but I've never read her novel Daniel Deronda, and this is I want to read this edition because it has an introduction by Edmund White, who is one of my favorite authors. So this was Eliot's final completed novel, and it's a social satire that sympathetically depicts Jewish proto-Zionist ideas. It will be 100 years since JD Salinger's birth, because he was born on January 1st, 1919, and I want to reread Catcher in the Rye, but I feel a bit nervous about this because I sort of wonder if it might be one of those books that's best left in my teenage years, because it's, you know, the ultimate novel about teenage angst and anxiety, all about this character, Holden Caulfield. Iris Murdoch will also be turning 100. She was born on July 15th, 1919, and I've read a number of her novels. I really love her writing, but I've never read her novel The Bell, so I'd really like to read that. That is her fourth novel, and it's a novel that explores ideas about a spiritual yearning in a materialistic culture. It's about a religious lay community, and the leader of that community is a closeted homosexual. And I find it really interesting how Iris Murdoch always, from this novel forward, she always included gay characters or homosexual characters in her novels in a really sympathetic way, and I really admire how she did that, and because she thought it was important to portray how it's just another way of loving. Another very influential writer who was born 100 years ago is Doris Lessing. She was born on October 22nd, 1919, and again, I've read a number of her novels and really admire her writing, but I've never read her novel The Good Terrorist. She was inspired to write this novel after the Irish Republican Army bombed Harrods department store in London. And so this novel follows a character called Alice, who is very politically conflicted, and she moves from commune to commune. Another writer born in 1919 who you may not have heard of is called Menna Gallie. She was a Welsh writer, and she wrote a novel called The Small Mine, which was first published in 1962, but it's been republished by a relatively new press called Hono Press, whose mission is to publish great Welsh female authors who have gone out of print. So I think it's a really interesting small press. And this novel is about a Welsh village and the lives of a number of different people who live in there and who work in a local privately owned mine. And then I have 4 novels who are celebrating big anniversaries since their publication. So the first of those novels I want to talk about is The Vampire by John Polidori. And this was first published 200 years ago. And I'm particularly interested in reading this because a couple of months ago I read Sheridan Le Fanu's short story called Carmilla about a vampire. And the Vampire was one of the first romantic vampire novels ever published and was very influential to the many vampire stories which came out since then. So I think it'll be really interesting to read. And it's about a member of the Irish aristocracy, a young man in the Irish aristocracy who befriends a lord of very mysterious origins. Lorna Doone by Richard Doddridge Blackmore. It's been 150 years since this novel's publication, and I'm particularly interested in reading this novel because I'll show you something. Let me get this. There is this memoir called Bad Blood by Lorna Sage, and Lorna Sage was actually named after the protagonist of this novel, Lorna Doone, and Lorna Sage was actually a teacher of mine at the University of East Anglia in 1999, the same year that she sadly died. And I love this memoir so much, and she was such an influential teacher of mine that I'd just love to read this romantic novel, which was the inspiration for her name. This is a romantic novel about a man whose father is robbed and murdered by the infamous Doone clan, but instead of becoming the sworn enemy of this clan, he falls in love with the daughter of the clan's leader. Valmouth by Ronald Firbank. This was first published in 1919, and this sounds like such a fun, different sort of novel. So it's set in a fictional British spa resort, and it's about the wealthy old women who frequent this resort and live there, and it's about the effects of a black woman and her niece who come to live at that resort. I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings by Maya Angelou, and it'll be 50 years since the publication of this memoir, the very first memoir in a whole series that Maya Angelou wrote that spread into 7-volume autobiographical series. And this first volume charts her progress from being a girl of 3 years old until the age of 16, and her development and growth and learning how to respond to the prejudice and racism around her instead of internalizing it. And finally, I want to talk about 4 classic books which there will be very special new editions of, or it'll be the first time that they've ever been published in the UK. So the first book is Dust Tracks on a Road by Zora Neale Hurston, and I've read her novel Their Eyes Were Watching God many years ago, but I never read this, her autobiography about growing up in the state of Florida. And when this autobiography was published, Alice Walker was very critical of it, but I don't know how seriously we should take her opinions, especially after some dodgy opinions she expressed in a recent interview. But I'm really interested in reading this autobiography. Another book that's going to be published by Virago Editions is the novel Corregidora by Gayle Jones. And this is the very first time this novel is going to be published in the UK. I think it's going to come out later in the year, around October or so. But this novel was first published in 1975 by Toni Morrison. I think Toni Morrison was Gayle Jones's editor, and the story sounds so interesting. It's about a blues singer who is consumed with hatred for the 19th century slave master who fathered both her grandmother and her mother. Another novel which is going to be published in the UK for the very first time in 2019 is Tamarisk Row by Gerald Murnane. and this is going to be published by And Other Stories, which is another one of my favorite publishers. And this novel sounds so interesting. It's a more recent novel, but it's interesting because Gerald Murnane. There was an article in the Guardian recently about how this author is one of the greatest Australian authors who you might never have heard of, because his books have not been published outside of Australia very much, but now they're finally coming to the UK for the first time. And this is his very first novel. So it's about a Catholic childhood which takes place in the 1940s, which involves a very pious mother and a father who is addicted to gambling. So I'm really interested in exploring this author's work for the first time. And then finally, there's going to be a new edition of Zelda Fitzgerald's novel Save Me the Waltz, which was actually her only novel that she ever published. And this is being published by Handheld Press, which brings out these beautiful new editions of classic novels. And I'm really curious to read this novel. There are very mixed reactions to it. But I think Zelda Fitzgerald is such a fascinating character. You know, she famously suffered from a lot of mental health issues, but she was very talented, was a very talented dancer as well as writer. And she sort of suffers from living in the shadow of her much more famous husband, F. Scott Fitzgerald. And this novel is a semi-autobiographical account of her life and her relationship with F. Scott Fitzgerald. So that's going to be really interesting to explore. So those are the classic novels that I want to read in 2019. Let me know if you're interested in reading along with me with any of these, if you want to buddy read any of them. But also let me know any classic novels that you plan to read in 2019. So I hope you're getting excited with ideas for reading plans to make for the next year, and I hope you're doing well, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye, everyone.